Okay, welcome everyone to the State Library for another very interesting event for National Family History Month for 2024. Just some general housekeeping. Could you please make sure that you already have your phones on silent? And I'd like to offer welcome to country. Libraries of Tasmania recognises the deep histories and cultures of the Aboriginal people of Lutruwita, Tasmania. We acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional and continuing custodians of the land, waters and sky. We pay respect to elders past and present who hold the memories, traditions and culture and knowledge of country. We extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose countries were never ceded. So thank you again, and today we welcome Scott Carlin, Managing Director of National Trust Tasmania. Scott has had a 20-plus year career with the Historic Houses Trust of New South Wales, where he managed some very well-known properties such as the Mint and Hyde Park Barracks, Vaucluse House and others, and is part of the management team for Government House Sydney. And he has a career devoted to heritage and has managed T-Mag's historic houses, which many of you would have been to, such as Narima, Markley and the Private Secretary's Cottage, and other off-site collections as Bothwell, Queenstown and Zia. And of course, we'd love to hear him tell us all about the convict memorial at Hobart Penitentiary. So join me in welcoming Scott.
Thanks, Yasmin, and thanks for a very poetic acknowledgement of country. The National Trust one is very plain compared to that. So I thought I would give a very informal talk today, mostly speaking to the images. Of course, welcome questions, but this is being recorded, so perhaps we save the questions to the end, and hopefully I finish ahead of time to allow lots of questions. I'm aware that I'm speaking to people who are very connected with the National Trust, including Brian Reset, who wonderfully secured the penitentiary site for the National Trust back in the 1980s. And Brian and volunteers managed the site for over 20 years. And it's always been, quite critical to the Trust's sustainability, that site. So, it's... I think we need to start the acknowledgement of Brian's work to secure the trust, because it was a fantastic outcome. So the outcome I'm talking about today is another sort of stage in the development of this site. I've had a background in looking after historic places for more than 30 years and always welcomed new ways of engaging people with our history and heritage. And it's quite remarkable the way in which these places, with their very complex cultural heritage, they're layered cultural heritage, they're like onions, they go on and on. There's always something in them to discover and put forward to connect with people. And I was recently in Fulham. So you go into any Tasmanian bookshop and there's always a Tasmanian history section. But you step off a plane in Sydney or Melbourne, there's no Sydney or Melbourne or New South Wales or Victoria history section. And Tasmanians clearly love their history. And so today, we've really welcomed the convict memorial at the Penitentiary Chapel, because it's another way of engaging contemporary audiences with our history. It's the most fantastic public history outcome for the site, and also it's a way of engaging tourists coming into Tasmania with the wealth of information there is about Tasmania's convict past. Of course, this project relates very closely to the State Library here. The State Library of Tasmania is the custodian of Tasmania's uniquely complete convict records. We had 75,000 convicts come to Tasmania, so about 62,500 convict men and over 11,000 convict women came to Tassie. And of course, the records survived on the penitentiary site, were discovered there in the 1960s and brought here to the State Library of Tasmania In 2006, they were inscribed on the UNESCO Memory of the World list, and then through different volunteer transcription groups, including the Female Convict Research Centre up at the Female Factory, and a group that's become Digital History Tasmania under the leadership of Hamish Maxwell Stewart. They've been transcribing and coding our convict records. So, Digital History Tasmania, I think, is up to 2 million convict records from about 60 different data sets, which have been transcribed, coded, and therefore can be presented in a new form through the Convict Memorial. So it's a wonderful repurposing of convict records, essentially to be a public engagement tool. And, with the trust involved in Tasmania's tourism economy, it's taking an archive and turning an archive into a tourism resource. So it's great to have the archive reunited with historic buildings, and it's also great to have the archive actually helping Tasmania's tourism economy, which is an extremely part of our economic stability these days. So the project, the Convict Memorial started with a group including Hamish Maxwell Stewart, architect Robert Morris Nunn, and Raw Film. Raw Film's represented by Craig Del Santa, Steve Thomas, and Matt Daniels. And they initially had the concept of a convict memorial at the Treasury buildings. The state government said no to that proposal, but agreed quite quickly that Court 2 at the Penitentiary Chapel would be a great place for this new attraction. And so what you see is the interior of Court 2 at the Penitentiary Chapel. So the Penitentiary Chapel, I'll show you a slide of it fairly soon, but it started off as a chapel, T-shaped, and then in the 1850s it was subdivided into 3 wings. So two of the middle nave became the Supreme Court of Tasmania, one of the wings became the Hobart Magistrates Court, and the 3rd wing was retained as the prison chapel. So this is one of the wings. This is the court number 2, and of course, to put the convict memorial into the chapel, we had the business of taking out the suspended ceiling, an acoustic ceiling rather like this ceiling, and returning to the original ceiling height. Of course, there was quite a lot of conservation needed. We had to patch the original ceiling. The original ceiling had been sort of sitting there decaying under the canite ceiling, and so a lot of the paint had flaked. And actually, we took the decision to take all of the oil-based paint off. There are only 2 layers from the 1940s, we think, and go back to original distemper paint that breathes. I mean, we saw this as our Sistine Chapel, our Tasmanian Sistine Chapel. It was an amazing convict-built structure of the 1830s, and so it was worth returning it to its original height and also ensuring that the ceiling would survive the ages through a permeable paint finish. We also, this is the slide that shows this most clearly. We also re-grained the beams. So when the chapel was finished in the 1830s, the convict painters got to work and they painted the beams in oak graining, which was a typical treatment of the day. And then we commissioned Raw Film. Raw Film oversaw Mona Technical Services to come in and build a gantry to support this central column of screens. There was about a tonne's weight in the screens, and so we didn't want to destroy the building through the weight of the screen. So some pretty interesting engineering was brought to make sure that the weight of the screens was distributed across the original structure within the chapel. Then on the windows that you see on the side, the windows had been enlarged in the 1850s when it became courts. In order to present the attraction, we had to put screens over the windows, and there's a series of projectors that project the weather of the day onto the windows. I mean, another little project of Hamish's was to go through and find the weather in Hobart every day in the 1830s. So we can project that. So I'll move on to, I'll just jump over this one. So this is an image of the Penitentiary Chapel. It's from Simon Bard's Convicts A to Z. And so it shows the intention of the original building. So the wing where the convict memorial is on the left there. The name of the chapel became the Supreme Court, and then the wing on the right was retained as the prison chapel. I mean, I certainly invite you all to come down and go on a tour of the building. It's quite a remarkable building. So it was built in 1831 to 1834. It really, we put it up for the Australian National Heritage List because it tells a unique part of the convict story. So it very directly reflects Lieutenant Governor Arthur's vision of convict incarceration and reform through the evangelising word. And so you can see in the middle of the chapel, you can see a communion table with a white cloth. Beyond that, there's a big triple-decker pulpit designed by Archer. Of course, the word would have been spoken at volume from the pulpit. The pulpit still survives. It survives in the prison chapel. The nave of the main building became reserved for free settlers of Hobart, and essentially the building became Hobart's first Trinity Church. So there was public access to the building from the 1830s through to the early 1840s, and then Trinity Church was built in North Hobart to the design of James Blackburn. So this is a structure that was created, was designed by John Lee Archer, who was the colonial architect and engineer. The tower, has been much loved by lovers of Tasmania's Georgian architecture. It probably was part of the basis for preserving the building. And the tower contained a stair that gave access to the rake seating. Under the rake seating, you'll notice all of these arch-topped divisions in the white underneath. And a slightly bizarre aspect of this building was that the rake seating was positioned over solitary cells for prisoners. So see, over 30 solitary cells were in this complex, and there were 30 solitary cells in addition to these in the main prison, which was next door, and you'll see a slide showing that fairly soon. So it's often claimed, I'm not sure how accurately, but the convicts doing solitary in the cells under the chapel could also hear the sermons being preached above, and that impressed upon them, their sinful state and their need for reform. Anyway, it's a very interesting building. So those two aspects, the solitary cells and the chapel itself, illustrate the two sides of the coin in terms of convict incarceration, but also reform through the evangelising word. And we think that's a pretty good basis to, it's a pretty unique, this building of all of Australia's convict sites really sums up those two concerns in the convict experience. So the chapel was just one of a larger site. Unfortunately, I don't have a pointer with this, but you'll see the chapel down on the right there. The site really began in the early 1820s with the Hobart House of Correction. So that's the buildings at the far left of the site. You'll see a range of buildings. So they began in 1821, completed in 1824. So they're before Lieutenant Governor Arthur. And then just after the Hyde Park Barracks in Sydney was built, so that's 1818. And so it's really Commissioner Bigg following around, checking what Governor Macquarie is doing and not doing, and saying, well, it's really time for you to build accommodation for Hobart's prisoners. This was a big step forward in terms of the convict experience, because prior to that, the convicts found their own lodgings in the town. So the whole sense of convictism was one of exile. The whole of Tasmania's geography was the prison. And it's only with the building of these barracks that convicts who are being retained for public works are being more closely regulated. In the middle of the site is just below where Melville Street came through. So is the Governor's House, and this is the location where Tasmania's convict records were discovered in 1963. So most of all of the records were kept on site, even for female convicts, and it was the chief office. Just in front of the Governor's House was a yard, and all male convicts arriving in Tasmania were processed on this site. So even convicts who later saw service in Launceston and other parts of the island, all ships came into Hobart. They were all processed here on site before being dispersed across the island. So today, in marketing terms, we're saying the convict story starts here because of that central role in convict administration and assignment. And just below the yard is two fantastic octagonal gatehouses. They were designed by John Lee Archer, and unfortunately, all of this complex was lost. It was demolished in 1963 after Risdon Prison had opened, and so the chapel was retained because of the courts continuing to be there, and it's a really quite wonderful survival. I mean, you can understand why the demolition happened because a convict. A prison in the middle of Hobart, I'm sure had a very depressing effect on the town. But again, some great riches were lost with that demolition. Moving on. And so this is a little bit, so a map. So you can see in the middle, the top Melville Street where it came through, the jailer's house, the yard where we think convicts were processed. There were yards off to the left as well. There was a big hall which was later a sisal mat making factory, and which might have been previously the hall where the convict treadmill was, which was another important place of convict secondary punishment. And you can see a whole range of cells through here and on the other side. And the surviving penitentiary chapels on the far right. And this is the back of the jailer's house as seen from Melville Street where the convict records were discovered. And, I'm sure many of you know what convict indents look like. This is perhaps not the classic indent with columns, but convicts were described in great detail. So, the records are remarkably comprehensive for these convicts. And you can see the table at the top. So it's got trade, height, age, complexion, head, hair, whiskers, visage, forehead, eyebrows, eyes, nose, mouth, chin. Also religion and place of origin and sentence and date were recorded in other versions of indents. And so this is the sort of grist for the mill of the convict memorial. So these records, are lifted and reflected in the memorial as it is presented in the prison in the convict memorial. This one also has a punishment record following on. Of course, it's for Martin Cash, who we all know. And this is another convict punishment record for a woman prisoner. So again, these records have been a part of the data set that's been transcribed for the convict memorial. They're continuing to work through them. I think the 1830s are certainly complete and the 1840s are underway. I've also popped in a photograph. Not related to the convict period, but to the prison period. The site became the Hobart Jail formally in 1858. we've got a collection of photographs of prisoners. So this is a 19th century prisoner, not just a Melbourne hipster from last week. And it's similarly not a portrait of the famous cabbage tree hat, which was such a symbol of Australian men through the 19th century. And Isaac Daly was committed for having set fire to a hovel, and perhaps his descendants set fire to the encampment in St David's Park last night. We can't be sure. But prison photographs are an extremely interesting area of study, and quite an evolving one over time, and quite an interesting one to us. The Convict Memorial has a lot of so one component of it is AI portraits, but the aim going forward is actually to access photographs of convicts presented by their descendants, and prison photographs, and the exhibition, the Hobart International Exhibition portrait photographs, to actually use those in innovative ways to come up with portraits, fictional portraits, or probably don't have quite the right word, but portraits that actually signal how people's convict ancestors might have looked. So this is, I'll just take you through how what the visitor experience is. So when you come into Court 2, through the doors, you'll see collection of names that float down the column from the ceiling. People can go to a small iPad, or they can use their own device to find the convict that they're after. And in future, if you use your own device, you should be able to save your convict and their timeline and places associated with them. That's the memorial continues to evolve. Then the second screen takes you through the crime. So the crime is, of course, recorded in detail for all convicts, including on the indent. And certainly the indent provides access to original court records. The third screen includes a lot of commentary on their physical appearance from the indents, and also takes you on the journey from the UK or other places, because convicts came from all parts of the British Empire to Australia. And then the fourth screen is their life in Tasmania. So, and we may integrate into the fourth screen a map showing their journey across the island. And the Convict Memorial is one of a series of digital interventions that we've brought to the Penitentiary Chapel. So there is a film called Pandemonium that provides a bit of an overview of the convict experience. And again, it's not very much tourism focused, but it's got a lot of really quite interesting data on convicts and life experience and ships, and a sense of when convicts arrived in greater number than others. And we've also created what's often referred to as the Harry Potter room. So the Rogues Gallery includes filmed face-to-camera narrations from 6 different convicts. So quite interesting. This is Solomon Blay, who is the convict hangman, and Martin Cash, and Margaret Coughlin, who was one of the only woman hanged on sight, and other convicts tell their original stories. I mean, the most corny one is the painter, gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Gould, yes, W.B. Gould. But the others are really quite good. I mean, and the scripts of their stories that they narrate to character are generally taken from their own memoirs and reminiscence. We've also installed in the windows. So the Convict Memorial, as I mentioned, aims to provide an AI-generated portrait of each convict, which is generated from a huge archival collection of photographs of working people from the 19th century. And the the portraits are also tweaked in an AI way from the detail in the convict indents. So it's a sort of portrait generated on the fly, and it's a positive portrait of what this person might look like, and it's been quite an interesting experience because a lot of people actually do respond very positively to the AI portraits, not having actually considered what their ancestors might have looked like. Over time, we're aiming to do a lot of crowdsourcing. So we're moving forward. We're going to invite people to assist in memorialising their ancestor. So as we know, lots of Tasmanians have researched their family history in great detail. Quite often people will have portraits of their convict ancestors. There might be portraits of the ancestors in old age, and we can tweak those portraits to provide a sort of sense of what they looked like when they were convicted or when they were transported. If a portrait doesn't exist of that first generation ancestor, there might be portraits of their children, or people could put themselves forward as the stand-in portrait for their ancestor. It's to historians might say, oh, okay, it's not authentic, and yes, we acknowledge that, but it's actually meant to trigger a closer involvement with people's convict pasts. It's kind of, until you sort of imagine a portrait, I don't think people really imagine people into the round. So among historians might have reservations about the AI component, but as long as we don't say this is definitively a portrait of your ancestor, that there's a little bit of space to inquire. I think that space is a useful one. So this is Eliza Morrison. So we're also conveying the stories of convict women, partly because it's a memorial to all of the convicts who came to Tasmania, partly because the records of convict women were kept on site later in the site's history. And as we know, when the female factory in Port Arthur closed in 1877, all of those inmates came to the Hobart jail. And so a female convict section was created in the 1870s on site. So Eliza Morrison has become our most striking AI-generated portrait, and we're essentially using her as a logo for the site. So one of the intentions of the Convict Memorial, the state government grant, so we received 1.25 million to build the Convict Memorial, the grant was titled the Convict Memorial Hub, and the Hub's section of that title is a signaler of our intention that this be a hub that people come to find convict biographies, and then they can follow those to convict sites across Tasmania. And so I'm just spruiking a few National Trust sites that have convict associations. So Runnymede, our wonderful Regency Villa in Newtown, was built by Robert Pitcairn, a lawyer based in Hobart, and Robert Pitcairn, of course, was a leader in the movement to abolish convict transportation and, of course, to achieve responsible government for Tasmania. So a very strong convict story there. We also have the convict story from the house's second owner. So Pitcairn sold the house in 1850 to Bishop Nixon. Bishop Nixon lived there with his wife, Anna Maria, and she had quite a close relationship with her emancipist cook, who at one stage helped her in the birth of a child, which came early and unexpectedly. Oak Lodge at Richmond is one of my favourite National Trust properties. It's so beautifully archaeological. It was built by the Buscombe family of builders who did so much building in Richmond, and of course its its second tenant was a brother of Charles O'Hara Booth, who was the commandant at Port Arthur. Clarendon in northern Tasmania, so a very important house for us, built in the late 1830s into the early 1840s. A very large convict labour force there. The barn actually has a whole range of accommodation for convict, emancipist and assisted immigrant workers on the estate. There's currently in the basement a projection of the convict workforce that worked on that property from 1816 through to the 1830s. And we'll be continuing to extend the interpretation of the convict labour force there. And the last property I'll show you was Franklin House, which was built by a publican called Britton Jones. And Britton Jones was, of course, an emancipist. And this house, like many other houses that we find in Tassie, including my own house, was a spec build by publicans. So it was publicans seemed to be very cashed up and, of course, put their money into buildings. And Franklin House is a great survivor of that heritage. So the Convict Memorial Hub is actually meant to take people from discovering convicts at the Hobart Penitentiary to convict sites across the island, including our sites and including the Port Arthur sites, Port Arthur itself, Cascade Female Factory, and even convict associated buildings through the city of Hobart. And not far from here we have the Jolly Hatters, which was a labour exchange. So much of, and of course there are remains of quarries and timber getting outfits in the Domain and on Kanani, Mount Wellington. So we've got a very rich convict heritage throughout the island. And so the aim is for the hub to be very much a hub and take people on journeys of discovery. So, I think it's a really quite remarkable public history outcome for convict records. So it's repurposing, the transcription of convict records, so that it's both a memorial and a tourism attraction. It's repurposing a courtroom as a memorial space. It's reuniting the archive and built heritage. It's adding a layer of digital interpretation to the incredibly archaeologically rich Penitentiary chapel site. And of course, it's aiming to send people across the island to convict sites and therefore contribute to the economic, sustainability of Tasmania's historic buildings through making convict sites, convict tourism a thing, and through people visiting convict sites, contributing to their economic sustainability. And so it's really great to see, an archive here contributing quite directly to Tasmania's tourism economy. So that's it.
Wow. Thank you very much, Scott. That was an amazing talk and very generous of you to give up your time. So thank you very much from us. Date lively. Thank you. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask?
The photos you do, while you're doing of the people, the convicts, do you use the same photo for about 1,000 and other people when you do an image?
Yes, it's early days. Yeah. So there's currently about 1,000 photographs that are being used for the basis of the AI photographs. Yeah. And as the whole experience will continue to evolve as new records are added, and we'll be going out to people to invite them to memorialise their ancestor through contributing some of the information and the images they have. So
because I went up there and did my 15 convicts.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And at first I thought they took the description of my convict, for example, and I thought, this picture that'd be him. But then when I got to the 10th man, he had the same picture. So I thought when I went up there, is there a sign anywhere? Because I couldn't find one to say to people, because I could see people going in thinking this is a brilliant thing, which I think it's still good, but think, this is my ancestor, even though it's used and put it in there truly. But there was nothing anywhere to say that. It was, you had the little pad.
Yes, we're not very good on signage, and yes, we do need to add it into the iPad.
And there was a lot of people coming in there, which was good. I mean, I love what you're doing, don't get me wrong, but I just thought at one stage I thought it was taking a description of my convict and putting a picture up. And a lot of my friends thought the same, that they were doing the same. Till you've just explained now. Yes. So I thought, make sure I heard all that. Yeah,
it's meant to be part of the guided tour, and we do have a guidebook in preparation, which will people through the AI
It's brilliant.
generation of the portraits here.
Any other questions?
Is it possible to see which settlers and which convicts? So I understand that a convict can be linked to a settler, but if there's a settler, can all the convicts who work for that settler be seen?
No. So the place to go for that is the Tasmanian Names Index. So yeah. So I mean, most of this information, most of the data is shared through the Names Index. So yeah, this is moving from the convict side of the story as opposed to the settlers to whom convicts were assigned. I mean, you'll pick up in individual convicts as you search, assigned to Mr. Meredith at Cambria, but you can't really search for Mr. Meredith back to convicts assigned to him.
I think that's a little way off. Yeah,
It's interesting.
yeah. There's a few employment registers, but not yet. I haven't had the names pulled out yet. It's index section. Anything else?
I'm interested in where the original records were found, trying to picture what that would have looked like. And so that's, do you know? And secondly, was that the entire archive there in that building, or were there other books found elsewhere around Hobart?
So I mean, there are archival estrays, and so so then we have been aware of things being found, and
The bulk of it was in
that jailer's house. So there's
so they just got up, walked away, and left all their books on the shelves.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a working prison through to 1963, and then as they considered the move to Risdon and vacating the site, it was a case of, okay, the library better come and look at these things. And of course, fortunately, they were all saved.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Brian probably has more.
I was sorry, but yes, the books were actually not in the jail governor's house. They were in one of the dormitories of the House of Correction.
Ah, right.
And originally, when they were talking about pulling the place down in 1960, after they moved the male prisoners to Risdon, they contacted the archives. Archives came in and said, look, we've got nowhere to put all this stuff. It was basically a room bigger than this, full of books, whole. And a lot of things did get destroyed. We don't know how much was destroyed because it's gone. But then eventually someone did come and say, look, okay, we've got to take this. And it was originally taken to what's there, the Treasury building, and stored down in the basement there before archives then got more space to store stuff. But yes, there are a couple of photographs of the room with books.
Oh, well,
Amazing.
we should get Bruce here. Yeah.
Can I be nuisance again? Did you say at the moment on your stage you're only given the convicts came out of the convict ship up to 1830, or was it adding those people who did things wrong up to say 1930 instead of the 1800s?
Ah,
Are
right.
they on there as well? Or was it just the convicts?
Yeah, it's people transported to Tasmania on convict ships to 1853, and of course they stayed in the system longer. And then the other comment was that the records continue to be added to. So there might be a record for John Smith in 1832, but it could be that subsequent records relating to his life and crimes, punishments, and assignments are added in on an ongoing basis.
It's not an ordinary one, and what came out free settler, pinched something and went to jail after 1898, had his photo taken and his record. Would that be on there yet?
That might be there in the evolution.
In the future?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what's happening. It's just being the two prisons.
It's quite, yeah, so the dealing with 75,000 individuals at this stage is, I think the transcribers have their work cut out with that group, and then
That's the others.
over time things will evolve.
All right, well, thank you very much again, Scott. And are you staying behind for any?
Happy to.
Yeah, so Scott will be here for a few more minutes.